considering that Resident Evil is a horror franchise, it really shouldn't surprise anybody that the games features some of the scariest moments in video games. From dogs and giant BOWs jumping through windows to a creepy ghost girl, Resident Evil continues to surprise us with some of the most terrifying monsters and jump scares. But one does wonder, which game does the best job at scaring the players? Well, on this episode of Nerd Space Games, that's exactly what I want to explore here today. Before that though, if you haven't already, be sure to subscribe for more ranking videos on your favorite horror games, especially if you love Resident Evil. Also, hit that like button if you enjoyed today's topic. Anyway, my name is Ruben with Nerd Space Games, and this is my top 10 scariest Resident Evil games. Let's get it. Number 10, Resident Evil Revelations. Revelations could have easily been one of the scariest entries in the Resident Evil franchise, especially if you look at the potential that this game had during the first half of the game. At the beginning, we see some terrifying sound effects as we explore the ship. Along the way, we come across deformed bodies and blood everywhere. Finally, we come head to head with our first monster of the game, an ooze-like creature with terrifying features. The game continues to build on this as we take control of Jill, who is defenseless with no weapon for a small section of the game. One of the scariest moments of Resident Evil Revelations actually takes place during the lead up to one of the boss fights of the game, the comms officer. As we slowly move closer to him, we start to hear him cry out the same lines, Mayday, over and over again as his voice sounds distorted and terrifying. So even before we open that door, let me tell you, I was scared shitless. Then we get a good look at this awful creature, with a saw-like weapon attached to one hand, a Venus flytrap-like head, and a human-like figure coming out of the side of the body of the creature that looks like he's still in pain. Yeah, this scene got me good. Unfortunately, as far as the scare factor, this game goes downhill from here. Revelations slowly pivots off of the scary side of the game and starts leaning more into the action comedy side of the game, especially as the game introduces characters like Quint, Keith, and Jessica. Still, this game does enough to at least break the top 10 for one of the scariest Resident Evil games of the franchise. Number 9, Resident Evil Outbreak. Resident Evil Outbreak is honestly one of the most underrated games of the franchise. It's a multiplayer experience that was far beyond its time. However, on top of the innovation that the game brought, Outbreak actually comes off as being pretty scary at times. Even though the player is rarely alone thanks to the game allowing you to have two allies, there are moments that still catch you off guard. For example, during the flashback scenario, there is a stalker enemy in the form of the Axeman. Axeman hunts you throughout the entire scenario. While there are some scripted moments where he will appear, a lot of the time he'll catch you off guard when you least expect it. Plus, Outbreak introduces some creepy versions of classic Resident Evil monsters. Personally, one of my favorites is the Suspend Dead. This creature is actually a zombie that is in the middle of the metamorphosis process that turns it into a licker. It's a human-like creature with a lot of the licker features, and it attacks the players with its long tongue as it hangs from a vent. Another feature in the Outbreak files is the infection rate. Something that we haven't really seen explored much in mainline games deals with the virus potentially infecting the players throughout the entire game. Since it is a virus, the longer you spend in each scenario, the more likely you are to become a zombie yourself. This adds a new layer of anxiety as now you have a time limit to complete the campaign while also trying to avoid taking damage so that the infection rate does not continue to go up and turn you into a zombie. Still, overall the game doesn't move farther up on this list due to the lack of scary moments in the game. Number 8, Revelations 2. When it comes to the scare factor, Resident Evil Revelations 2 has improved in just about every single way compared to the first Revelations game. Unlike the first game, we don't have characters that are mainly there for comedic relief, like Quint and Keith of the first game. However, what really helps Revelations surpass the first game in terms of it being scarier comes down to two key traits: the setting and the monsters. We'll start with the setting first. The story of Revelations 2 puts the main characters on an island infested with gruesome monsters. Only after investigating do the players find out that the monsters are test subjects. On top of that, during Myra and Claire's section of the game, we learn that they have bracelets that monitor their levels of fear. If they let the fear overwhelm them, they get changed into one of those creatures that they are fighting against. Speaking of the monsters, that's the second part of the game that really helps make the game scarier than the first Revelations game. These creatures are truly terrifying, as most of them are human body parts kind of smashed together to create some truly horrifying creatures. For example, the Revenants are some of the scariest looking monsters of the franchise. The way the body parts are kind of stitched together sort of reminds me of a Silent Hill monster. Oh, and one other monster that is actually really kind of scary is Alex Wesker herself. While she may be one of the easiest boss fights of the series, that doesn't take away from how much she scares the living hell out of me. That deformed face and unproportional body that's only being held together by her spine gets me every single time. Number 7, Resident Evil Village. Listen, I'll be the first to say that the direction Village took the franchise wasn't it for me. Don't get me wrong, I love Village. It was a lot of fun to play. However, coming from Resident Evil 7 that focused more on the roots of horror that Resident Evil was built upon, and then playing Village after just kind of set me up for disappointment. With that being said, Village is still a pretty scary game. Sure, it's nowhere near the level of Resident Evil 7, but I would argue that it's still in the top 10 scariest Resident Evil games, and it even features some truly terrifying and memorable moments. The most iconic scary moment of the game is, of course, House Benevito. In this section of the game, Ethan is searching through the basement of the house. While doing so, he comes across the most terrifying monster you've seen in this game, a giant, screeching baby monster. Seriously, this thing is just a massive fetus chasing Ethan throughout the basement of House Benevito. What makes this encounter even scarier is that Ethan is left with no way to protect himself. The only thing you can do in this situation is hide and then make a run for the elevator when it's safe. There are a few other moments outside of this one that stands out. One is your first encounter with a lichen. While under a house, you'll see one feeding on a corpse. However, out of nowhere, you'll get a fantastic jump scare from a different lichen nearby. Between Lady D as a stalker enemy inside her castle and a few other moments within the game, Resident Evil Village still makes a case for being in the top 10 scariest games of the franchise. The only reason it doesn't find itself higher on this list is due to a majority of the game focusing more on the action side over the horror side of the game. Number 6, Resident Evil 0. It shouldn't be too much of a surprise to see one of the harder Resident Evil titles cracking the list for one of the scariest games of the franchise. That's because a big part as to why this game is so scary deals with the impending doom of being killed by a new monster the moment you enter a room. Resident Evil 0 challenges the player more than any other game in the franchise in terms of the regular enemies throughout this title. Enemies like Eliminators and Leech Zombies pose a tremendous threat to the point that they can easily stun your characters before they even get a chance to get a single shot out. So every time you enter a room and then all of a sudden you hear that violent flute start playing, your heart immediately skips a beat, knowing that you're about to come face to face with one of the most challenging creatures of this game, Mimicry Marcus. Speaking of your heart skipping a beat, let me introduce you to yet another terrifying creature that will haunt your dreams, the Lurker. Lurkers are pretty rare, and you've probably only seen one or two pop up during a single playthrough. However, after your first encounter with one, you'll start to dread every single moment you find yourself near water. That's because Lurkers can randomly jump out of the water and scare the living hell out of you. On top of that, they have an instant kill attack. Of course they do. If the player is unable to escape or kill the Lurker fast enough, then the Lurker can grab the player with its tongue and swallow them whole. Resident Evil 0 finds a unique way to embrace the scare factor by using the intimidation of regular enemies roaming the hall. Because of the threat they pose and the feeling of never knowing what to expect each time you open a new door, we find Resident Evil 0 as one of the scariest games of the franchise. Number 5, Resident Evil Code Veronica. With Code Veronica, we see one of the last classic Resident Evil games before making a big change with Resident Evil 4. What's really interesting about this game is that out of all the mainline entries, this one is probably played the least, which is sad considering that this game is fantastic. However, with it appearing to be a spin-off since it doesn't have a number attached, some casual fans just skip this one completely. But for those that did get around to playing it, you'll be treated to one of the scarier games of the franchise. As for why that is, well, it comes down to a lot of things. Firstly, the music of this game is just something I have to talk about. I feel like out of the entire franchise, this game has probably the best overall soundtrack, with some really tense and creepy tones to the main theme for the Ashford twins, and even the aggressive tracks you hear during the moments of panic. Resident Evil Code Veronica kills it by setting the mood for a horror game with its music. Another factor is the enemies. While the designs of them probably don't match up to some of the others on this list, Code Veronica does a great job of making most enemies more intimidating. For example, putting a giant worm that can swallow Claire and instantly kill her, or by creating intense boss fights that make the player feel anxiety throughout the entire encounter because of how challenging and intimidating they are. You even get some pretty good jump scares out of this game. For example, a Bandersnatch jumping through a window right after you played a creepy music box. Another example is the zombie that pops out of a metal coffin after you stab a sword through it. But Code Veronica doesn't just rely on jump scares. We even have moments that just builds up the tension throughout the scene. For example, the doctor in the body bag that moves as you leave the room. Then knowing that you have to come back into that very same room, you tense up. The heartbeat sound effect as you're walking through a door expecting something scary also does a great job at setting the mood. With all of these elements combined, it's really hard to put Code Veronica anywhere outside of the top 5 scariest games of the franchise, so it lands at the number 5 spot. Number 4, Resident Evil 2 and Resident Evil 2 Remake. For this entry, we included both the original and the remake, as each bring different elements to the table that help elevate this title overall. Out of the entire franchise, I feel like Resident Evil 2 is the best when it comes to jump scares. I feel like this game has more of them than any other entry on this list. In either the original or the remake, we see stuff like zombie arms grabbing at the player as they are walking through a hallway, lickers jumping through a see-through mirror, and a personal favorite of mine, the zombie door. Yet the game doesn't just focus on its jump scares. Scenario B in the original game introduces Mr. X as the first ever stalker enemy of Resident Evil. He will chase the player throughout the entire game up until your final fight against him at the end of Scenario B. His presence was unnerving, and every time he appeared, we found ourselves panicking as we tried to either escape from him or put him down. The remake even took this concept one step farther by including him in both playthroughs of Resident Evil 2. This time, Mr. X became a vital part of the gameplay as he was even more aggressive and more intimidating than the last time we saw him. Still, it doesn't really feel right to talk about how scary Resident Evil 2 is without also mentioning the creature designs of this game. For example, we get one of the scariest monsters in Resident Evil history, the Lickers. This humanoid creature that crawls on all fours while also licking its lips and making horrifying sounds as it grows closer to you gives me goosebumps just by talking about it. William Birkin's multiple transformations, Ivy zombies, and the G-monsters are some other examples of truly terrifying creatures in this game. It's hard to find a reason to not include Resident Evil 2 in the discussion of the scariest games in the series, so that's exactly why we find it here at number 4. Number 3, Resident Evil 3 Nemesis. Speaking of stalker enemies, Mr. X may have been the first one to appear in the series, but it was Nemesis that really helped make the concept of a stalker enemy really popular. If you were to ask a fan of the franchise to name a stalker enemy in Resident Evil, chances are they'll probably say Nemesis first. Mainly, that has a lot to do with how much of a presence he had in Resident Evil 3. See, unlike every other entry on this list, most of the reason this game is scary comes down to one specific element: Nemesis himself. Nemesis is the most unpredictable enemy in Resident Evil. He will appear at times when you least expect him. Sure, Mr. X in the remake of Resident Evil 2 did a great job at trying to copy this concept, but it still never lived up to the original Nemesis. The fact that he could just appear randomly forced the player to always be on their toes. For example, you might find yourself exploring a specific area that you have been to multiple times. Then out of nowhere, you'll hear a door open, followed by Nemesis screaming and then bolting towards you. Because of his speed, he makes Jack Baker and Mr. X look like turtles next to him. While they may walk fast, Nemesis in the original game will literally bolt towards the player when he first comes out. Plus, he poses a much bigger threat thanks to his arsenal. Sometimes he'll appear with a rocket launcher, a minigun, hell, even a flamethrower. Between the unpredictability of Nemesis in the original game, the fact that he is still undeniably the most intimidating stalker enemy of the franchise, and the arsenal at his disposal, I guarantee you that every time Nemesis pops up, you will be in tears because of how scared you are. Oh, and did I mention the RPD window jump scare? Yeah, that one gets me every single time, even when I know it's coming. While Nemesis is the biggest reason why this game is so scary, there are a few other things to note that help elevate the scare factor of Resident Evil 3. Just to name a few, there's the Gravedigger, the Hunter Gammas, and the Drain Deimos, which obviously are pretty scary because they are giant bugs, and giant bugs are terrifying. Number 2, Resident Evil 7. I honestly went back and forth between the last two entries, but ultimately I settled for having Resident Evil 7 as the second scariest game of the franchise. Regardless of how you feel about Resident Evil 7 and the direction that Capcom took with the franchise, it's undeniable that it is one of the best horror games of the last decade. Resident Evil 7 was the first numbered entry to be in first person instead of either fixed camera or over the shoulder. Because of the new perspective, Capcom was able to deliver some truly terrifying moments in Resident Evil 7. Now, I'll admit Resident Evil 7 does suffer some problems near the end of the game as it starts to fall back into old habits with it being action focused. However, there's no denying how scary the game is for a majority of the experience. Starting off with the prologue of the game, we see Resident Evil take their approach of something that somewhat resembles the Evil Dead as Mia appears to be possessed and trying to murder Ethan with a chainsaw. From her slowly crawling up the basement stairs like a demon straight out of an Exorcist movie to her cutting Ethan's hand off with a chainsaw, Mia definitely sets a tone immediately at the start of the game. You would think that with such a big start to the game that would be hard to deliver the rest of the way, but man, let me tell you, you're just getting started. Jack Baker gives Mr. X and Nemesis a run for their money as a stalker enemy as he's aggressively following Ethan throughout the Baker house. He'll pop up when you least expect it, and if you play on Madhouse mode, you'll get even more surprises from him. Even though he talks to Ethan as he chases him, surprisingly, this just makes him even creepier as you run throughout the halls trying to escape him. His wife, Marguerite Baker, shouldn't be underestimated either. With a few jump scares from her and probably the scariest monster design out of any other enemy in this game, Marguerite Baker brings a lot to the table in terms of the scare factor. I don't think I've been more scared in a boss fight than I was during the entire encounter with Marguerite Baker. The new first-person perspective also adds a new layer of fear. Because of the new perspective, you as a player are unable to see what's behind you and how close, say, Jack Baker is to you as he's chasing you. The only way is to fully turn around, which could prove to be fatal. Plus, you feel like you're in the shoes of the main character thanks to the perspective and the fact that Ethan is a faceless main character. Oh, and don't even get me started with the VR mode. Number 1, Resident Evil Remake. Like I said earlier, I went back and forth between this one and Resident Evil 7, but I just felt like Resident Evil 2002's Remake is just slightly more terrifying overall. Now, I totally understand if you disagree with me, especially if you want to bring up that VR mode for Resident Evil 7. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that Resident Evil Remake just had everything you would want from a scary game. For one, the setting. Nothing can or will ever compete with the feeling that you get from being trapped in the Spencer Mansion. The feelings of fear and anxiety that you get from exploring the Spencer Mansion is unrivaled. The music in the remake really helps sell the setting though. Every room and area has a specific tone thanks to the incredible tracks we get as we're exploring the mansion in the remake. Personally, my favorites include the main hall theme, the guardhouse, and the aquatic facility under the guardhouse. Let's talk about another factor in scary games, the jump scares. This game does have its share of them. Obviously, there's the most iconic jump scare, the dog hallway where they jump through the windows. Actually, the remake does a fantastic job at still making this feel fresh for fans of the original game. Instead of them just jumping through the first time you walk through that hallway, we just get a small piece of glass breaking off, which, by the way, that still scares the hell out of me. So we assume that, okay, I guess it's safe to travel through here in this version. Well, if you make that assumption, then try going through that hallway from the other end. Doing so will bring out the iconic dogs jumping through the window scene that we all love. Of course, there's other scary moments that are here in the remake as well. The zombie slowly turning around after feeding on Kenneth is one iconic moment. It's the first ever encounter with a zombie in this game, and it's a major moment of the series. Still, the remake doesn't just relive scary moments of the original game. If it did, it probably wouldn't be number one. What Resident Evil Remake does that helps elevate it to the scariest game of the franchise comes down to some of the new features added with this version of the game. Like, the remake introduces two iconic and scary monsters to the series, the Crimson Heads and Lisa Trevor. Crimson Heads are easily some of the scariest monsters of the series, and it's honestly weird that we have yet to see them not make a comeback yet. What makes them so terrifying is their unpredictability and how dangerous they are. Normally, you might kill all the zombies in a specific hallway to make it easier for you to travel from point A to point B. However, in the remake, the Crimson Heads can punish you for that decision. That's because after killing a zombie, there is a chance it could rise again and become a Crimson Head. These creatures are much faster, stronger, and more dangerous than the normal zombie. So, hearing the sound of one rising can easily make you sweat, and you'll find yourself racing for the nearest door to escape them. Lisa Trevor, while not as terrifying or intimidating as the Crimson Heads, still makes the player nervous each time they approach her. The sound she makes as she moans and drags her chains towards the player is enough to offset even the bravest of gamers. There's so much to talk about here, but I'm already running out of time, guys. Overall, Resident Evil Remake does everything right to create an atmosphere that is truly more terrifying than every other game of the franchise. Whether it's the setting of the Spencer Mansion, the unpredictable reanimations of Crimson Heads, or the iconic moments and jump scares brought to life again from the original, Resident Evil Remake claims the title of scariest game of the Resident Evil series for all of these reasons and more. But that does it for this episode. What do you guys think about my number one pick? Is Resident Evil Remake the scariest game of the franchise, or do you think another one deserves that title? Also, I know some of you are already hitting up the comments about the lack of Resident Evil 4 and its remake. Listen, I get it. Regenerators are fucking scary. That being said, nothing else in that game scares me personally. But if you think it deserved a spot on this list, then let me know in the comments, and also tell me where you would have put it at and which game you would have taken out for it. Anyway, if you haven't already, be sure to subscribe for more ranking videos like this one, especially if you love Resident Evil, as I love doing content on those games. But thanks for watching, and as always, I'll catch you guys up on the next episode of Nerd Space Games. Take care.